There's something remarkable about de Gaulle's ability to remain completely opaque, to give himself as many options as possible, while everybody believes that actually he supports them.
Hello and welcome to this week's pod. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Now, after Tuesday's bonus episode on top 10 families of world history, I'm a bit breathless because Seabag got involved in the Twitter and then a whole load of people waded in with their suggestions. Most wanted the Habsburgs included, which, to be fair to them, they're a decent family, so make the subs bench. As for the many suggestions for Roman families to be included, that's a straight no. Apologies to Peter Stothard, but it's Greeks first and last, and Romans nowhere. Anyway, that's enough of that. On to this week's pod, which is a fascinating chat, if I do say so myself, with a legendary historian, Lawrence Freedman. He's written a new book, Command, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine, in which he looks at the personalities involved in various wars, and so we chat about some of the famous ones, such as Vietnam, and the earlier French one in Indochina, Algeria, which is the subject of one of my favourite films, The Battle of Algiers, the Falklands, and many more recent conflicts, including Iraq. We also discuss individuals such as Douglas MacArthur, the American general in the Pacific at the end of World War II, and after that, various French commanders who, amusingly, and we only hint at this, seem to need the key qualification of being attractive. At Dien Bien Phu, the disastrous French defeat in the Vietnamese jungle in 1954, in the French position, each of the 10 hills was named after a girlfriend of the commander. Now, I do not condone this behaviour. Now, we do mention Algeria, as I say, and I just wanted to make sure you'd be aware of a couple of French terms that are mentioned. Algérie française was a phrase used at the time of the conflict, in the mid to late 50s, when French residents and those sympathetic to the French presence used the term to describe Algeria. Also, l'état c'est moi, you should be familiar with that. It's what Napoleon said, the state is me. This isn't a discussion about military tactics though, but about the characters of the politicians and generals that is so key over who wins a war. This book was one of my picks for 2022, and Lawrence is, as I mentioned, a legendary figure in the history world. He's written books such as Strategy, a History, and The Future of War, a History. He served on the inquiry into the Iraq War, which was also known as the Chilcot Inquiry, and he was knighted nearly 20 years ago. Before we get on with the pod, for listeners of this podcast, I can offer you a discount of 50% off an annual subscription to the magazine. So that's only £5 for 6 issues of Aspects of History, and we also take payments in dollars. Christmas is coming, you might want to gift a subscription. The discount code is History 50%, and I've added that code into the show notes for you. If you can subscribe or review, that would be great, but in the meantime, I'll hand you over to me talking with Lawrence Freedman. Lawrence Freedman, welcome to Aspects of History, and thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
And I was very keen to speak to you because having read your book, Command, the Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, there are conflicts in here that range from the well-known, such as Vietnam and the Iraq War, to others less well-known, such as East Pakistan. And each one is fascinating in itself. And I wanted to ask to start with, what were there certain criteria you used to pick the conflicts that are in the book?
Yes, they were loose, I should say. It wasn't a very scientific process. I think the starting point was first that I was going to look at post-1945. So that was the big decision. There's lots of stuff written about command in the world wars, and the historical development of command practices. But I just have a general feeling that post-1945 military history is still not very well developed. So that was my first choice. Second was that though I was bound to have to look at the UK and the US, and they're the two countries I know best, I didn't want to get myself confined by them. So I wanted to look reasonably far and wide, and I didn't want to be just look at regular armies against regular armies. I mean, there's a surprising number of those sort of conflicts to look at, but obviously there's the counterinsurgency operations, the colonial operations like Algeria, rebel groups as in the Congo or in Ukraine in 2014. So I wanted to have a variety of types of conflict. And then I suppose the two deciding criteria were was actually interested. I mean, these are, I didn't want to go just through stuff I already knew. So conflicts that intrigued me that I needed to know more about. And then could I get good material? I mean, this was a lockdown book. I could still get hold of books, memoirs and so on, but I wanted something approaching primary material so that the sort of authenticity about the language that's being used and how the various generals are talking about themselves and their conflict. So I wanted areas where there were good digital sources, and it's surprising how much there is now. I mean, it wasn't as difficult as it might have been. So the combination of these factors, more or less, but there are plenty of others I could have looked at. I mean, I did Kosovo, but I could have chosen Bosnia, for example. But in the end, they were all research topics that kept me interested, which is actually, in a sort of selfish way, the first requirement if you're writing a book. And I think demonstrated the range of command and civil military relationships there'd been since 1945.
Well, we cover, there are many different administrations. There are democracies, we've got dictatorships, democracies masquerading as dictatorships and dictatorships masquerading as democracies. I wondered, is there a, I suspect I know the answer, but is there an ideal, an ideal model between military and political leadership that works best?
Yeah, I think that there's, and it depends a lot on personalities. And one has to say that even the best models can make screwed up decisions. I mean, it's structure doesn't always guarantee a good strategy. So I think the best models are those where there are clear civilian and military competencies, that they understand their distinctive roles, but they talk to each other. And part of the book was to challenge the idea that the ideal relationship is one in which the politicians provide the objectives, the civilians provide the objectives, and the military set about implementing them with as little interference as possible from the politicians. I don't think that works. I think you both need to be respectful of each other's judgment, but the politicians really need military advice when deciding on what's achievable, what objectives make any sense, and the military can't really grumble if the politicians are looking a bit over their shoulder when they're the ones who are going to be answerable if the whole operation fails. So and there's questions to ask, and I think I tend to assume in good diplomatic, I tend to assume in good policy making with any organisation that challenge and criticism, if there's time for it, tends to produce better decisions. I think one has to be realistic about it as well, that some decisions are going to be very lonely ones for both politicians and commanders. They're the ones who have to take the responsibility. But the extent to which you can have an informed conversation between the two spheres, I think by and large, makes a better chance of a better decisions, and we can pretty clearly see some pretty awful decisions that were taken as a result of that lacking.
Well, I thought we could just drill into a few of the conflicts that are in the book, and we'll kick off with the first one, which is Korea, which I think should be much more widely known because it was a major war, and it was the only time I'm aware of, and you'll probably correct me, but it's the only time I'm aware of where the Americans, under the auspices of the UN, invaded China. And
no, they didn't quite invade China. They got close to China.
Oh, did they not? Right.
So the issue with Korea was that after the North Koreans had been pushed out of the South and sort of kept on running, as it were, MacArthur wanted to unify the country. So the issue was at what point, when you get close to the border with China, will the Chinese think that this is getting too close and intervene? And that's what happened. They got too close and the Chinese intervened, as they had been warned was quite likely.
And MacArthur, though, had this sort of unparalleled power as a commander for the Americans.
No.
And you mentioned respect earlier. He certainly didn't seem to respect Truman, his superior, his commander in chief.
No, he didn't respect his superiors in uniform either. He was a law unto himself. I mean, he was because of he'd taken the surrender of the Japanese after the Pacific War. He was almost revered in Japan because of the way he'd re-established the country after the Second World War, and he'd had great success in the first months of the Korean War, where he had quite bold moves, helped to push the North Koreans back. So he was far more popular than Truman in the country, but hubris tends to set in, and he trusted his own judgment and didn't test it against anybody else's judgment.
It occurred to me whilst reading the book that even though he, as you say, was more popular than Truman, was he not more? It was inevitable that when push came to shove, the commander in chief, the president, would always win over the general.
It was a political judgment of Truman. I mean, he was advised that it was high risk, and it may be, in the end, one of the reasons why he didn't stand for election again in 1952. In the end, constitutionally, it was clear who won. I think and the other factor which tends to get neglected is that the other chiefs of staff, were also fed up with MacArthur. They were worried that he kept on ignoring their instructions, that he had there's a rogue maverick aspect to what he was doing. So they were quite anxious to put him back in his box as well. So without that, I don't think Truman would have got away with it. And if, in a sense, if MacArthur hadn't faltered, if the Chinese hadn't invaded, if the Americans hadn't been put onto the back foot, then again, Truman would have probably had to put up with his insubordination. But the stakes had got just too high by April 1951, when eventually he was pushed out.
Well, moving on to, and I wanted to talk about another commander who goes off reservation a little bit later, because they are in here. But the conflict in Indochina, what is now Vietnam and Cambodia, I guess it would have been Laos as well at the time, and the French disaster at Dien Bien Phu, and there seems to be this kind of ideal of a French commander. They all seem, well, for a start, they seem to have to be good looking and attractive to women. That seems to be a prerequisite.
At the time, yes.
Yes. But they all seem to have very good qualifications for command, and it just seemed to be a breakdown of communication between and relationship between commanders both on the ground and more senior levels.
Yes, I think that's fair. It's just an interesting way the French generals tended to get written up in the 1950s. But the ones in charge of the campaign in Indochina were very distinguished. I mean, had been, there's no doubting their personal bravery, or that they were sort of knowledgeable about military matters. The basic problem in Indochina was that the government in Paris knew that this was a losing cause, and was basically trying to get the best position within Indochina for anticipated peace talks. But they never quite worked out what that meant in terms of supporting the local commanders, doing what commanders try to do and work out a winning strategy. They never gave them the resources, the political backing, and so on. Whereas the Viet Minh, the communists, understood this all perfectly well, and hence the fact that General Giap, in charge of the battle, was threw everything he needed to at it to make sure he won. So you can then criticize the generals for failing to think through potential communist strategies, and for bickering amongst themselves. It wasn't a united front, and it has been rather distant from the battle. I think they formed views without actually visiting Dien Bien Phu. I mean, they visited it before the fighting started, but they weren't really keeping track of it as the fight developed, especially because there was a point where the French on the ground recovered to a degree, and with reserves might have been able to hold the line for much longer and make things very difficult for the communists. But by the time the generals relented on sending reserves, it was too late, and the reserves essentially went into captivity. So their basic judgments were pretty poor, even given the fact that the situation was pretty poor to start with.
Well, in the same chapter, you cover the Battle of Algiers, which features, I think, some veterans of the war in Indochina. Yeah. And again, the French government's objectives differ from the military leadership. And I wondered, and de Gaulle takes over sort of midway through. Had de Gaulle chosen to make, Algérie Française, that if that had been his objective, do you think that the result would have been different?
Good question. So, de Gaulle, historically, after as leader of the Free French in 1945, had been all for holding on to all of France's colonial possessions, including in Indochina, which is one reason why the army thought he would be sort of on their side when they helped to install him in power in France. But de Gaulle realized that though actually his generals, in this case, delivered a victory, they beat the FLN. They stamped out the pretty brutal methods, stamped out the insurgency, but they couldn't really stamp out the political movement for independence. And de Gaulle realized this. It wasn't just, it's one thing when the terrorists are blowing people up in the cafes of Algiers. It's another thing when there's just mass demonstrations and strikes demonstrating the support of the Algerian people for independence. And de Gaulle was shrewd enough to understand that, and he never, and as you suggest, he never. Only once did he utter the words "Algérie français" because he didn't want to tie himself. There's something remarkable about de Gaulle's ability to remain completely opaque, to give himself as many options as possible, while everybody believes that actually he supports them. So he all these sort of gnomic pronouncements that, which was one reason why it was such a shock to the generals in Algeria when he announced, in the end, it wasn't that big a deal if Algeria got independence, given what they'd been through and taken all their troops through. This was they saw it as a great betrayal. So I think de Gaulle's a very good example of a political leader who realizes that whatever objectives you've got, or even established yourself, in this case inherited, you've got to judge it against political reality. Can you actually meet them? And if not, you have to make a big adjustment, which is certainly what he did. And he did, and one reason he could do it was by avoiding giving too many hostages to fortune.
Well, you've mentioned it was a pretty nasty war, and of course it was. It was terribly brutal. And I wondered, one thing that comes out, I suppose, is with Western countries, they almost, if there's a breakdown in moral authority in a war, that rather destroys it altogether at home. Would that be fair to say? Whereas, that's not something that Putin has to worry about today.
No, not self-evidently, no. So one of the reasons for the disaffection, the alienation almost between the civilians and the military, was the belief that the politicians had knowingly asked the military to sort this out, knowing that it wasn't going to be very pretty. The standard line is, this is not a job for choir boys. And turned a blind eye to it. But when public opinion got unhappy, they didn't defend the generals. It showed up, the tension between fighting a war in an uncompromising way that may produce victory, and keeping public support, having a degree of legitimacy to what you're doing. And that it's an argument that hasn't stopped. Still, it's evident in the French debate to this day about the extent to which those who had fought and died and saw their comrades die and so on felt betrayed by the fact that politicians wouldn't accept what they felt they had achieved. So if there'd been a more open discussion, it might well have ended differently.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is I spoke with Max Hastings fairly recently. The detail and the difficulties that Kennedy had with his chiefs of staff implied that was, well, I don't know. I kind of got the impression, obviously there was risks on the ground, but the sort of rather deranged approach from some of the American generals was why we were close to nuclear war. But that's, reading your book, I didn't get the same feeling. More from, as I mentioned, the sort of junior officers on the ground could have easily have prompted a war.
I think what interested me about Cuban Missile Crisis was that the president clearly wanted a restrained approach. And he made that clear. He didn't want any sort of inadvertent escalation. And in the end, of course, you are dependent upon the common sense of the local commanders. And you can argue that in the end that's what happened, though there were some tense moments. I mean, it seems to me at the senior levels, although Kennedy was intensely irritated by what the chiefs of staff and LeMay and so on, in the end, the system still worked. They didn't, they did their constitutional duty. That they managed the forces professionally and so on. The system looked more likely to break down on the Russian side than on the Soviet side than on the American side, because you'd sent these poor submariners out into incredibly inhospitable situations without giving them very much by way of decent orders. And then, they were hounded by the American anti-submarine fleet. And there are these famous incidents that may or may not have happened as described, but illustrate the fact that potential was there, where you were dependent upon restraint being shown at a very low level, which it was in the end. The Cuban Missile Crisis, you either say, God, how close it was, or in the end, it didn't happen because people realized just how high the stakes were, and when restraint was necessary, exercised it.
The system worked, and they had a jazz band when they needed one.
Yes, that was it's a nice note that in order to reassure the Soviet submariners that there wasn't a war going on, the American destroyer had a jazz band play, which just, according to the Soviet captain, irritated him, and he had to tell one of his crew off for stamping his foot to the music.
But was that a bit of a master stroke? Just going back to the leadership on the American side, was it a bit of a master stroke of Kennedy to only have Maxwell in the ExComm meetings, or he would only have ever had Maxwell in those meetings rather than people like May?
Well, you've got to understand the reasons that ExComm existed, which was not a decision-making body; it was an advisory body. If he wanted to make a decision, he'd have fewer people in a room, sometimes just his brother. So he had small meetings with Admiral Anderson, who was actually the chief of naval operations. So the point about ExComm was advisory and to debate the issues out for him. So I don't think he would have found it particularly helpful to have too many military there, because they all have said the same thing anyway. The problem was that Maxwell Taylor was Kennedy's appointment, so it's never clear how much the other chiefs wholly trusted him. And they were in a, this is a collection of guys all with stellar war records, who'd seen it all, and effectively they're dealing with a guy who was a junior officer, in charge of PT boats. So they had screwed up over the Bay of Pigs, and always seemed to them to be a bit windy, too soft, and so on. So this wasn't something new, this relationship. In the end, though, they didn't. The one interesting exception, which I mentioned, it's not wholly an exception, is that the head of Strategic Air Command made a public message, a message that was bound to be noticed by the Soviet, when he went on to higher alert status, which could have been seen to be provocative, but the fact that he went on to higher command status was agreed. It was an agreed policy.
It almost seems with the military's disdain for civilian leadership. I mean, Kennedy, yes, he was a junior commander, but he had fought in the Second World War.
Yeah.
It's almost like a civilian leader can't win, even if they need to have a military record to be respected by.
It was a difficult. Remember, also Kennedy followed Eisenhower, who, he and MacArthur were the two great, very contrasting commanders of the Second World War, and as well Eisenhower rather than MacArthur was the one who became president. So he just didn't seem to these guys to be in the same league. Although Eisenhower was in times of crisis as cautious as Kennedy was, but he had a more confident judgment. Kennedy was very apprehensive. I mean, he almost thought that he'd come to power to be the one to decide on Armageddon. It was that sort of scary. So I think the chiefs picked that up. I mean, they didn't like it. I think, and also you've got a fellow like Curtis LeMay, who is almost a Strange-Lovian caricature. Despite it's clear. I just read another book about the Pacific bombing campaign. An extraordinarily gifted commander. I mean, not at all like the strategy adopted, which was quite a cruel one in incendiary bombing of Japanese, but clearly had a grasp of command. Yet they'd almost turned into caricatures of themselves by this stage. And the real crisis of civil-military relations was not particularly over the Cuban Missile Crisis, but over the extent to which they had taken advantage of the unavoidable degree of delegation of responsibility with all the nuclear stuff, to put themselves in a position where they could be deciding on whether there was nuclear war or not, and if there was a nuclear war, whether it was going to have any restraints on it at all.
Well, so far we've talked French and American leaderships, and I was speaking with Barney White Spunner in the context of actually the partition of India in 1947, right. The fact that you had many troops on the ground confined to barracks during this sort of horrific slaughter going on. But we kind of went off on a tangent in which he started talking about the differences between France, the US, and British structures of military leadership vis-a-vis the civilian political leadership. And he was saying that he thought the British of the three probably were the weakest of the three, because whilst the American military leadership is given sort of carte blanche when they are on the ground, French have more of a presence in the Élysée Palace and with the Prime Minister as well, whereas the British, there's a sort of mutual distrust between civilians and the military. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, a lot of it may depend on personalities and sort of timing. I mean, I would say under the Falklands, Terry Lewin, the Chief of Defence Staff, played the War Cabinet brilliantly, including the Prime Minister. He was respectful, he explained things, but he was pretty forceful with his advice. And argue Charles Guthrie as Chief of Defence Staff with Blair at the time of Kosovo. The relationship was pretty good. And Barney was sort of in senior positions, probably less good, with Brown and Cameron in different ways were not great with their generals. And I think there's neither of them were people who had much to do with the military, up to the point where they suddenly found themselves having to take quite big decisions. So there's sort of an issue there of a political interest. Oddly, I think we may well find that Boris Johnson's relationship with generals was pretty good, because he quite was interested in what they did, and the UK was taking a pretty proactive role on Ukraine, obviously not fighting. It's hard to imagine, for example, that Sunak is going to take similar interest, because that's not his thing. He looks at numbers. So an awful lot depends on personalities as much as structures, I think, would be my basic argument. So you can have, civil military relations in the US sort of broke down in some ways during Clinton. Not particularly with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but the military really didn't like Clinton. They hadn't. He'd ducked military service. He didn't live to the highest standard. He seemed to be saying what he said depended on who he was talking to. All of these things meant the civil military relations were very poor there.
And does it make a difference if a politician is sort of centre left? Because I guess military, one would assume they tend to be a little bit more sort of centre right.
You would assume. I don't really see that as an issue certainly in the campaigns I was looking at. Blair, famously could get quite belligerent. The politicians could be quite. Cameron was not quite cautious enough in Libya, but I think the politicization of the military was more an American phenomenon than a British one, and obviously at one point a French phenomenon as well. And there's normally very specific reasons for the disaffection. In France, it was the case that the military felt they'd done the dirty work, and then we just had become an embarrassment, and all their dirty work was to no avail anyway, because the cause was betrayed. With Johnson in Vietnam, the military did what they could with the restraints that were given, and it was really more later that this sort of critique that it was all unnecessary political interference took hold. But although it's undoubtedly the case now, or was the case, I think Trump changed quite a bit. The military was sort of Republican leaning in the state. I don't think that is as definite now. And I think that probably, I don't think it was ever quite as true in the UK either.
Well, I mentioned, I think I've referred to Ariel Sharon. I wanted to speak about him because he was certainly an extraordinary figure.
Yeah.
And I was reading that chapter. At one point, Sharon talks about the receiving orders, how he views orders, and he says, "Well, the order's good if it is for the good of the state." And I couldn't help sense there was a certain sort of Napoleonic l'état c'est moi.
No,
is that Sharon really was sort of a law unto himself, similar to MacArthur? Then was he?
Yeah, not quite a senior when he was in uniform, but I mean, Sharon's a fascinating, complicated character. He's not a simple man to read. He was clearly a very gifted commander, had loyal subordinates, tried to take care of his men, but he was also reckless and had this supreme confidence in his own judgment, and was totally, I mean, instinctively insubordinate, because he believed unless you were close to the battle, you couldn't understand it. I mean, that was the basic point of his whole approach. The if you tried to control a battle from a distant headquarters, you were bound to get it wrong. So give your subordinates the latitude, which is a sort of a general approach that people like to adopt now, but it has problems. And Sharon illustrated some of the problems, one of which is, how do you coordinate different commanders with different, each with their own division, but fighting, it seems, different wars? How do you divide scarce resources between them? When they're both vying for a position, who do you put first? And these sort of issues can only be handled by the centre. They can't be delegated. So MacArthur's approach, which essentially, what's good for the state as the first question, is not up to him. I mean, in the Israeli system as in ours, it's the senior political authority decides these matters, not him. But that was part of the arrogance with which he operated. So the politics of Sharon are fascinating. So long as he could be controlled to a degree, then he was incredibly effective. But as soon as he became Minister of Defence himself, he was appalling, because there was nobody holding him back and questioning his judgment.
Well, yes, in 1982, I was reading, watching an interview with Ronan Bergman, the Israeli journalist, who described an order given by Sharon to, and I think it was verified. It was described by a senior commander and verified by a second, that Sharon had ordered the downing of a commercial airliner in 1982. And I mean, when you look at his is the order good for the state? And that order was ignored, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was sort of outright disobeyed, but that does suggest, completely warped approach to what's good for the state and what isn't.
Yes. I mean, he was a schemer. He had plans, and I think, and that's what made him an audacious general, is that he could work out plot lines, if you like, and on that basis, he could, work out cause and effect. That if he did this, the enemy general would be caught out that way, and it would work. Which was fine if you just, working within the confines of a battle. Not so good if you're in a high political role and you believe you're manipulating somebody else's whole political system, which is where it went wrong. So he had. He believed, in the sort of the decisive act, which is a problem of men of action. If you just do this one thing, it'll be transformational in itself. And he was wrong. So if he were in a contained space, in a contained part of the conflict, he could be very effective, because he was prepared to take risks and be bold. But in In other circumstances, when he was given a high political role, not so much. I mean, it proved disastrous. It's a key thing that why you need politically aware generals, but generals not necessarily in charge, is unless you understand politics well, which he didn't. I mean, he didn't understand Lebanon. Then you trample on all the wrong toes, and you try to push people in a place or assume they're going to get to a place, as with the Phalangists, the Christians. They're never really going to go, and plenty of people who knew Lebanon were telling him that. But he sort of always had these, he was a schemer.
Well, there's so many fascinating conflicts to talk about more, but we're running out of time. But I just wanted to cover a couple more,
Sure.
couple more things. Now you do go into the Falklands into quite a bit of detail, for obvious reasons. I know you've written extensively on that, but it seemed to be there were so many that, as you mentioned before, the relationship between politicians and the military was good, but there were so many what ifs throughout that war. That one small thing goes one way, and it could have easily been a defeat for the British. Even Margaret Thatcher speaking to Leach persuading her to even go down to the Atlantic. Had she not done that, would she have even won in 83?
Oh, would she even have stayed in power in 82? I mean, I think she stood up on the Saturday, which I remember listening to, on the 3rd of April, and could announce that a task force would be sent. And if she hadn't been out, and if all she'd said is that, we're talking to the Americans and we'll impose sanctions, then she could well have been out. So that particular intervention by Leach was probably, one of the most important ever in British political history by a military officer. So, well, you do have an option, Prime Minister.
Technically, he overstepped the mark there, didn't he?
Technically, overstepped the mark. Well, he didn't. He didn't overstep the mark by saying you can send a task force. That was good military advice. He overstepped the mark by saying you should send a task force, which he recognised was overstepping the mark. And she asked him why, and he gave his reasons, which were highly political and patriotic and went beyond the purview of military advice. But I don't think that, what the advice was, here's an option that the Ministry of Defence was telling you you don't have and you do have. And if you're going to take this advice, don't do it by halves. You've really got to do it properly. You've got to send everything you can, because you've no idea what you'll need.
And did Margaret Thatcher appreciate how close the war was? Because I know you've spoken with her.
I think all of those involved were aware of things that could have gone badly wrong, of which, anything happened to one of the carriers, that would have been it. So they were very conscious of that, the consequences of a troop ship going down or something. All of these things were discussed. They never quite lost the initiative. So you didn't ever quite have a moment, other than the, sort of the original invasion, where where it looked like we were playing catch up again. Dislodging Argentine forces from the Falklands was obviously a massive undertaking in itself, but in each step along the way, the British seemed to know what they were doing, and if they didn't quite, they got away with it anyway. And so politically, that was quite important. But everybody involved was well aware of how it could go badly wrong, and I think that was important in producing some quite sober decision making. It wasn't. There weren't. I mean, again, some argued at the time we don't need the Falklands. The whole thing is pointless, and that was a political judgment to make. But given you'd made the alternative political judgment, this was unacceptable. They were pretty sober about how they went about their business.
Well, you also cover the invasion of Crimea in 2014, and we're now, in this ghastly conflict at the moment, and seemingly no immediate end in sight. How do you think Zelensky? I'm just quite interested if you've got a sort of any way of knowing how Zelensky deals with his commanders, because he's obviously got this sort of great support amongst his people. Putin, we know about, and so much has been spoken about that. But I'm just interested in Zelensky and his relationship with his soldiers, his commanders.
It's different. It's quite different, and I think we need to know more about it. To be honest, I mean, Zelensky's got no background in military affairs, and his key role has been a political role, an absolutely vital one, both of sustaining morale amongst his people and badgering allies for weapons, not officially allies, but badgering his supporters for more support, better equipment, more ammunition, and so on, which he's done very effectively. There are rumours that he's actually a bit wary of his chief of general staff as a potential political opponent in the future, which is quite normal in these circumstances. But in the end, they're in a war and they have to win it. So I think he gives the military quite a lot of latitude. You don't get the sense that he's interfering a lot in sort of detailed, hold this territory, don't hold that. Although I'm sure he's consulted, because it's one of the things you do as a general. You make sure that you're not operating sort of on your own, that you can show that these difficult decisions were shared with the politicians. Otherwise, if things go wrong, you are very much on your own. So as far as one can tell, the systems work pretty well, not perfectly, but pretty well. And they've had the advantage, although they've had some really grueling and difficult battles. Actually, though in individual encounters, they occasionally come off worse. By and large, again, similar point to the Falklands, they've sort of held on to the initiative since the early days of the war. In a much more unequal situation. I mean, it is quite a remarkable performance by Ukraine.
It really is. And just final thing before we go, do you? You've mentioned the Falklands. That was an overwhelming victory. Is a victory maybe not on that it's obviously it's a completely different geography, but is the prospect of a victory over Russia now a realistic prospect? Because I don't think we would have thought that 2 months ago, would we?
Well, I was always reasonably confident. Well, I was always confident that Russia wouldn't win. I mean, Russia losing is a slightly different proposition. And I don't think, that's certainly not a done deal by a long stretch of the way. I mean, it's a very grueling fight. The basic issue that we're all grappling is at what point does Russia realize that this is just game is not worth it anymore, that the losses are too high? And my concern, it's quite a long way down the line before they realize that. But I mean, there are, there's three fronts at the moment, all of which the Ukrainians are in a slightly stronger position now. And one of them, it wouldn't be surprising to see a breakthrough quite soon. And in those circumstances, that question is, again, how long can the Russian military, who've lost an awful lot of officers and equipment and reputation and soldiers, how long can they keep this going? So I think in the end, the balance is with Ukraine, but it's very difficult. And if this does drag on, then you can imagine the pressures growing on Zelensky. But the fact is, Russia has shown no interest in negotiation. I think one of the real difficulties we've got now is that because although Putin can't win, he really doesn't want to lose, and he'd rather. It's more important to him, if I get this right, it's more important to him to be seen not to be losing than to win. Survival in power depends on there still being something to fight for. Essentially, his interest is in keeping the war going, which I find a sort of disturbing conclusion, but I think that's where he is. So you really are, in the end, very dependent upon whether or not the Ukrainians can have more battlefield successes. I think that's the only way I can see as bringing this war to a conclusion.
Well, we have to hope that happens. Well, Lawrence, thank you so much. It's been absolutely a real pleasure speaking to you.
I could talk to you. And thanks for the review as well. It was a nice review.
A pleasure. I'm now going to leave the military stuff for a bit, and we're going to have Leander Dalal on talking about Henrietta Maria, wife of Charles I, and so part of two great families, the Stuarts and Bourbons. I've also got Tessa Dunlop on the early courtship and life of Elizabeth and Philip. And I've also got Peter Hughes on where our society is headed if we don't heed our history, and a bonus episode in December on top 10 movies with distinguished and award-winning director Tim Hewitt. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and review if you can. Thank you, and good night.